He built a tech empire worth millions, but it took one glance at a little girl in a white dress to shatter everything he thought he knew about his past. Los Angeles, 2017. The city buzzed with heat and ambition, a constant thrum of movement and noise that mirrored the pace of Matthew Carter's life. At 33, he had everything most people dreamed of: wealth, status, influence. As the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, he lived in a penthouse overlooking the city skyline, traveled in private jets, and made headlines simply by walking into a room. On the surface, Matthew's life sparkled. But beneath the polish, something crucial had eroded. He came home late again that night, past midnight. His tie hung loose, his voice hoarse from back-to-back meetings and investor calls. The apartment was silent, dimly lit, unusually tidy. No toys scattered across the floor. No soft laughter or baby giggles from the nursery. A sinking feeling gnawed at his chest as he walked through the quiet halls. When he stepped into the bedroom, the drawers were open. The closet, half empty. Her side of the bed untouched. On the nightstand, he saw a handwritten note, folded in half. He knew what it was before he even picked it up. "I can't do this anymore," it began. Haley's handwriting was still as neat and deliberate as he remembered from college. She had taken Sophie, their 1-year-old daughter, and left. There was no drama, no scene. Just the clean finality of absence. She hadn't taken much, just what mattered. Diapers, clothes, formula, a few toys. The rest remained, like a museum of a life that used to be whole. He stood there for a long time, holding the note in one hand, his phone in the other. He didn't call. Not yet. A part of him had known this was coming. In the beginning, Haley had tried, God, she had tried. She waited up late for him, brought Sophie to his office during lunch breaks, asked for just one weekend without his laptop. And he'd promised. Promised after the next pitch. After the next product launch. After the next round of funding. But the next never came. And now, neither had they. Outside the window, the city stretched endlessly, millions of lights, millions of stories. His success had made him a giant among men, but in this moment, he felt impossibly small. He had climbed to the top of a tower, only to realize it was built on sand. He sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at a pair of tiny pink socks still on the floor. Sophie's. Her little feet had kicked them off one night as Haley rocked her to sleep beside him. He hadn't noticed then. He noticed now. San Francisco, 2024. The restaurant was one of those modern rooftop places with glass walls, ambient jazz playing low, and the kind of service that made you feel important just for sitting down. Matthew Carter wasn't meeting anyone special that night, not romantically, at least. It was a business dinner, another in a long string of negotiations with a startup he was planning to acquire. He had arrived early, as always, preferring to scan the room, control the environment, and settle into his thoughts before the performance began. He sat by the window, watching the city shimmer beneath a pale evening sky. The waiter brought him a bourbon, neat. He thanked him and glanced briefly at the menu, though he rarely changed what he ordered. As he looked up again, something shifted in his periphery. A child. A girl, maybe 6 or 7, skipping lightly between the tables, her blonde curls bouncing with each step. She wore a white dress, the kind with delicate lace and small satin bows. She wasn't loud or disruptive, just curious, moving through the space as if she owned it. Matthew's glass paused halfway to his lips. His heart, out of nowhere, stuttered once, hard. The girl turned toward him. Her eyes, crystal blue, locked with his for the briefest moment. He froze. Not just because she was beautiful in that effortless, childlike way, but because she looked like him. No, more than that. She looked like Sophie. His body remained perfectly still, but inside, something erupted. He hadn't seen his daughter since she was 1 year old. He had no updated pictures, no social media clues, no school photos tucked into wallets or pinned to a fridge. Nothing. But there, in front of him, stood a child who had his eyes, his cheekbones, even a certain defiance in her posture that felt bone deep. It didn't make sense, but it also made perfect sense. The moment stretched, became too much. The girl turned away, running back toward the far side of the restaurant where a woman sat near the window, sipping from a wine glass, her back partially turned to him. Matthew stood without thinking, like his legs had decided before his brain caught up. As he walked toward the table, time folded in on itself. The years fell away, the noise of the restaurant faded, and then, she turned. Haley. She looked different, older in the way that only emotional weight can shape a person. Her hair was shorter now, more practical, curled at the edges. Her features were the same, sharp, elegant, unmistakably her, but her eyes were colder, cautious. She saw him, and her face didn't crumple, didn't soften. It stiffened. But she didn't look away. Matthew, she said. Just his name. No surprise in her voice, but no warmth either. It was a recognition. A collision. He glanced quickly to the girl who now stood beside her mother's chair, gripping the edge of the table, still watching him with that same curious intensity. He couldn't breathe. That's her, he whispered, not knowing if he was asking or stating. Haley didn't move. Yes, she said quietly. That's Sophie. He didn't sit right away. He just stood there for a moment, staring at Haley, then at the little girl next to her, the weight of 6 lost years pressing down like a slow avalanche. Sophie tilted her head slightly, trying to place him, the way children do when they sense familiarity without memory. Haley finally nodded toward the empty chair across from her. Matthew lowered himself into it slowly, feeling like the air around them had grown heavier, denser, as if every word that might be spoken would require effort just to push through it. She didn't offer a smile. She didn't ask how he had been. She just watched him with a quiet tension in her shoulders, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. Sophie leaned into her side, whispering something too soft for him to hear. Haley bent her head and answered gently, brushing the girl's curls from her forehead. The gesture was so natural, so maternal, that it cut Matthew in a place he didn't even realize still bled. I didn't expect this, he said at last, not really sure what he meant by it. He hadn't expected to see them again, certainly not like this. He hadn't expected his heart to remember so quickly how it used to feel to be part of something more than just work and routine. Neither did I, Haley replied. Her voice was low, level. We don't usually come here. It was a friend's idea. Birthday dinner. She's beautiful, he said, looking at Sophie again. Her eyes flicked up to meet his and didn't shy away this time. She was studying him carefully, like she was cataloging the shape of his face, the sound of his voice. She is, Haley agreed. And smart. And stubborn. Her gaze flicked back to him. Like someone I used to know. He nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't know how to find you. You didn't really try, she said, and though her voice was calm, the wound beneath the words was clear. You had your world. You let us go. He wanted to argue. He wanted to explain that he had hired a private investigator, that he had searched court records, old addresses, anything he could find after the initial months of silence. But by then, Haley had already moved on, left no trail. And he had let the weight of his guilt and his shame anchor him to inaction. Instead of chasing them, he buried himself deeper into his work, into board meetings and quarterly reports, into partnerships and stock prices, telling himself that maybe she had been right to leave. You're right, he said. I didn't try hard enough. That admission seemed to surprise her. Her posture softened a little, just a fraction. Sophie, still listening, began to draw invisible patterns on the table with her finger. Does she know who I am? He asked. Haley shook her head. I didn't think it was fair to tell her a story with no ending. I want to know her, he said, the words falling out like they'd been waiting for years to be spoken. I don't know how, or what that would even look like, but I want to try. She's not a project, Matthew, Haley said. You don't get to just insert yourself now that it's convenient. I know, he said quickly. I'm not asking for anything. I saw her, and I knew. It was like being struck by lightning. I couldn't walk away. Silence lingered between them. Outside the windows, the lights of the city glimmered, but inside the table held its own gravity, its own universe of unspoken things. Finally, Haley looked at Sophie, then back at him. You can have dinner with us. Tonight, she said carefully. We can talk. You can talk to her. Nothing more for now. He nodded, and something in his chest eased, just slightly. That's all I'm asking. They sat in awkward quiet for a while. Sophie picked up her napkin and folded it into a triangle, then tried to balance it on her water glass. Matthew watched her, fascinated by the smallest movements, the way she chewed the inside of her cheek when she concentrated, the tilt of her eyebrows, the rhythm of her speech when she finally asked him if he liked cats. And he answered. They talked about animals, then books, and slowly, the ice began to crack, 1 inch at a time. Haley mostly listened. She watched the exchange like someone standing on a frozen lake, unsure if the surface would hold or give way. But Matthew didn't push. He asked simple questions. He laughed softly at Sophie's stories. He forgot, for a moment, that he was supposed to be cautious. He just let himself feel. As the waiter cleared their plates and brought dessert, Sophie looked up at him again, her eyes still impossibly blue. You talk like me, she said. And your eyes are like mine. He smiled, caught somewhere between joy and heartbreak. I think we have a lot in common. Haley's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. Her guard didn't drop completely, but for the first time since he sat down, she looked at him not as a stranger, not as someone from a life she left behind, but as someone who might still matter. Over the next few weeks, Matthew saw Sophie several times. At first, it was always in public places, neutral ground, as Haley called it. A museum here, a bookstore cafe there, an afternoon in the park. Haley was always nearby, watching quietly, sometimes sitting on a bench with a coffee, pretending to read, but her attention was clearly locked on them. It wasn't easy for her to let go, even just for a few feet. And Matthew understood. He hadn't earned trust yet, he was barely beginning to scratch at the surface of what it might mean to be a father to a child he hadn't held in 6 years. Sophie, for her part, was cautiously open. She was curious but not naive. She didn't call him Dad. She called him Matthew. He never corrected her. Instead, he followed her lead, letting her guide how close he could get. Sometimes she'd reach for his hand when they crossed a street, and those fleeting seconds would live in his mind long after the day ended. Other times she'd pull back into herself, growing quiet, retreating into a book or turning her face toward the window in the car when he tried to make conversation. He tried not to take it personally, but of course he did. Every silence from her felt like a judgment on the years he hadn't been there. One rainy afternoon, they sat in a library, tucked into the children's reading corner. Sophie had chosen a stack of picture books she claimed were too easy but still fun, and she made him read them out loud. She corrected his voices, told him which characters were supposed to sound funny and which ones were serious. He listened carefully, adjusted, and saw a spark of approval in her expression. At one point, she giggled so hard at a frog wearing a tutu that she had to lean into his shoulder to keep from falling off the bench. He didn't move. He barely breathed. It was the first time she had touched him without thinking. Later that day, while Haley stood a few feet away talking to a friend they'd run into on the sidewalk, Sophie and Matthew sat on the edge of a fountain. She swung her feet over the side, watching the water ripple. "Why weren't you there?" she asked suddenly, her voice small but direct. "When I was little. When I had my cough all the time." Mommy said I used to cough a lot. The question pierced through him with such sharpness that he forgot how to answer. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked at her, so calm, so direct, and realized he had no excuse that would make sense to a child. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that you buried yourself in work because it was easier than facing your failures? That you let time pass because you thought it was already too late? I made mistakes, he said finally. Big ones. I thought I was doing the right thing by working a lot, by trying to build something important. But I forgot the most important thing in the world. I forgot you. She didn't say anything at first. She looked down at the water, kicking her shoes softly against the stone. Mommy doesn't forget things like that, she said after a while. No, he replied. She doesn't. She's a better person than I was. Sophie glanced at him, then looked away again. You're trying now. I am, he said, feeling the words catch in his throat. And I'm going to keep trying. No matter what. That seemed to satisfy her, at least for the moment. She nodded slightly, then slid off the edge of the fountain and started walking toward Haley without another word. He watched her go, his heart aching with the weight of what had been lost, and with the fragile hope of what might still be saved. Later that night, Haley sent him a photo. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch, clutching a small stuffed frog they had picked out together at the bookstore earlier that day. The message was short, she smiled in her sleep. He stared at the picture for a long time. He didn't reply. There was nothing he could type that would say more than what he felt in that moment. She had smiled. And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to earn it. One cold morning in early February, the sky over San Francisco hung low and gray, and the city moved a little slower than usual under a blanket of fog. Matthew had just stepped out of a board meeting when he saw the missed call from Haley. She never called him during work hours, not unless it had something to do with Sophie. His chest tightened slightly as he returned the call, already bracing for bad news. But when she answered, her voice wasn't panicked, it was resolved, calm in that way that signaled she had already made a decision before picking up the phone. I got a job offer, she said without any build-up. In Austin. It's a creative director position. Good company, great benefits, better schedule. I'd be stupid not to take it. He stood on the rooftop terrace of his building, the wind tugging at his coat. It took a second for the words to sink in, and then another second for the implications to follow. When would you leave? He asked, though he already knew the answer would come too soon. End of the month, she replied. They want me there by March. I'd need time to settle in, get Sophie enrolled in school. Everything would move fast. He closed his eyes, gripping the phone tighter. And you're planning to take her with you? She's my daughter, Matthew, Haley said softly, but not apologetically. Of course I'm taking her. She's mine, too, he said. There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet desperation beginning to seep through the cracks. You can't just take her halfway across the country. Not now. You had 6 years, Haley said. 6 years to call, to write, to find us. You came back into her life 2 months ago. Don't pretend that gives you rights, it doesn't. He didn't respond right away. He stared out over the city, barely seeing it. Traffic moved like silent film reels far below him, lives intersecting, separating. Somewhere down there, Sophie was in school, laughing or reading or maybe painting, unaware that the people who loved her most were on the edge of tearing her life in two. I can't lose her again, he finally said, and his voice cracked just enough for her to hear something real behind it. Haley sighed. Then what do you want me to do? Say no to a job that could finally give us stability? That could give Sophie more time with me, better opportunities, better schools. I want to be part of her life. Not on holidays, not in weekend visits, but every day. I know I didn't earn that before, but I'm trying to now. Don't punish her for my failures. She was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, he heard the weight of her own exhaustion. She didn't want to fight. She didn't want another battle. She had fought too many already. And yet, they were here again. I don't want this to turn into a custody war, she said, almost more to herself than to him. Then let's not make it one, he said. Let's do this right. But what was right? For her. For Sophie. For him. The lines blurred. A week later, he filed for joint custody. The legal process was swift and sharp, like the slice of a cold blade. Lawyers laid out their histories like chess pieces, his absence, his wealth, her stability, his effort, her sacrifices. Everything was weighed, measured, documented. They met in mediation more than once, and each time ended in cold standoffs. Matthew remained calm on the outside, but inside, every moment felt like a countdown toward losing his daughter all over again. Haley, though clearly overwhelmed, stood her ground. She didn't scream. She didn't throw accusations. She simply presented the truth. She had raised Sophie alone. She had been both mother and father. She had held her through sickness and school projects and nightmares. And now, just as things were finally balancing, Matthew wanted to rewrite the rules. But something shifted during one of their last sessions. The judge, tired of the formal back and forth, requested to speak with Sophie privately. Both parents were nervous, but they agreed. Sophie sat in a quiet room with child specialists and the judge. When asked about her feelings, her answers were simple, but clear. I love my mommy, she said. She takes care of me. She knows my bedtime songs. And what about your father? The judge asked. Sophie hesitated. He's learning, she said. But he tries. I think he wants to know me better. The judge asked where she would like to live. I want to be with mommy, she said. But I want to see Matthew too. I want both. It was that last sentence that changed everything. Later that night, when the court ruled in favor of a shared custody agreement, Sophie staying with Haley during the school year but spending every holiday, every summer, and long weekends with Matthew, he didn't feel like he had won. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like balance. And that, for the first time in his life, was enough. The morning of the hearing arrived with an eerie stillness. The streets of San Francisco were unusually quiet, wrapped in a blanket of morning fog that clung to the sidewalks and muted the city's usual noise. Matthew woke before dawn, long before his alarm, and sat on the edge of his bed in the dim light. He had slept no more than an hour, maybe two. His mind had been restless, circling around a single thought: what if today ended with Sophie walking out of his life again? He dressed slowly, deliberately, choosing a navy suit, not too sharp, not too casual, and a plain tie. He didn't want to look like a CEO today. He wanted to look like a father. A man who had made mistakes but was trying to make them right. As he looked in the mirror, he hardly recognized himself. The clean-cut lines of his face were familiar, but there was something different in his eyes now, something heavier and more grounded. At the courthouse, the waiting room was colder than it needed to be, and the fluorescent lighting made everything feel clinical and detached. Haley sat at one end of the row of plastic chairs, her lawyer beside her, flipping through paperwork. She wore a simple gray dress and had pulled her hair back into a low bun. Her posture was stiff, but her eyes betrayed her nerves. When Matthew walked in, she looked up, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. He gave her a small nod. She didn't return it, but she didn't look away either. Their lawyers spoke in hushed tones, negotiating last-minute details and clarifying procedural steps. Matthew wasn't listening. His eyes kept drifting to the door Sophie would come through. They had agreed she would speak to the judge alone, accompanied only by a court-appointed child specialist. It was standard in cases like this. Still, the idea of her sitting alone in a room answering questions about who she loved more tore at him in ways he couldn't articulate. When she finally entered, he stood instinctively. She was wearing a navy blue dress with little stars embroidered on the collar, and she held her small hands tightly in front of her. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she looked both older and more fragile than he remembered. She glanced at him quickly, then at Haley, then down at her shoes. The court officer led her through a side door, and then she was gone. The next hour passed like a slow bleed. No one spoke much. Pages rustled. Pens clicked. Every second stretched. Then, at last, the judge reappeared and asked both parties to return to the courtroom. The judge, a calm woman in her 60s with a face lined by years of decisions both painful and necessary, began speaking without preamble. She reviewed the facts, summarized the arguments, and acknowledged the emotional weight of the case. Her voice was measured, almost detached, but then she paused and looked up directly at Matthew and Haley. "This is not a case about unfit parents," she said. "This is a case about timing, about presence, and about the difficult task of balancing history with hope." Then she read from her notes. When asked who she wants to live with, Sophie said, "I want to be with Mommy. But I want to see Matthew too. I want both." The words landed like a quiet storm. Matthew looked down. His jaw clenched involuntarily, not in frustration but in something more fragile, relief and grief folded together. The ruling came next: primary residence with Haley in Austin, with scheduled and protected visitation for Matthew, including major holidays, school breaks, and alternating summers. Weekly virtual calls. Monthly in-person visits when possible. A parenting coordinator would help mediate the transition. Haley was still, unreadable. Matthew didn't move either, afraid that any motion might fracture the delicate calm in the room. The judge closed the session with a final reminder: this child is not a prize to be won. She is a person. And she will need both of you, in different ways, to walk through this with her. Outside the courtroom, the air was crisper, the sun beginning to push through the clouds. As they walked out, Matthew caught up to Haley. "She said she wanted both of us," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Haley looked over, her voice soft. "She did." They stood there for a moment, no longer opponents, just two people trying to navigate the aftermath of a life once shared, now split and stitched back together in a different shape. "Thank you," he said finally. "For not pushing her." Haley nodded. "Just, don't disappoint her again." "I won't," he promised, and this time, it wasn't a performance or a plan. It was a vow. One made not to a court, not to Haley, but to a little girl with star patterns on her dress, who had stood in front of a judge and asked for something neither parent had dared to hope for. A family, not perfect, but possible. The first real day of the new arrangement felt strange, almost surreal. Matthew stood outside the modest one-story house he had just moved into in the quiet suburbs outside Austin, Texas. The yard was smaller than anything he'd owned before, the front steps chipped, the mailbox slightly crooked. But he had chosen it on purpose. It was only 5 minutes from Sophie's new school, and 2 blocks from the local library. There was a park down the road, and a small lake nearby with paddleboats and fishing docks. It was a place built for real life, not press releases and polished meetings. For the first time in years, he didn't care that there was no elevator or doorman, no sweeping skyline view. All he cared about was what would happen inside those walls. He spent the first few days setting up the place with a kind of obsessive care. He bought furniture that didn't match anything from his penthouse back in San Francisco: soft beige couches, a wooden dining table with a couple of paint stains already on it, bookshelves he built himself, crookedly but proudly. He turned one of the bedrooms into a space for Sophie, decorating it with the help of a handwritten list she had mailed him: glow-in-the-dark stars for the ceiling, beanbag chairs, a frog-themed bedsheet set, and shelves for all her important stuff. He hung her drawings on the wall even before she officially moved anything in. The first time Sophie walked through the door, her backpack bouncing, she paused in the hallway and took it all in like she was stepping into a different world. She didn't run up to him or cry or say anything dramatic. She just looked around, wide-eyed, and finally said, "You really did all this?" "I did," he said, smiling nervously. "For you." She nodded and wandered toward her room without needing an invitation. Later that evening, while they were eating pasta and garlic bread he had almost burned, she said it again, more softly, like it had finally settled in. "You really did all this." Their days slowly began to take shape, like clay being molded in uncertain hands. Matthew drove her to school every other week, picking her up with snacks in the passenger seat. They tried to build routines, even if they were awkward at first. Tuesday was movie night. Sunday mornings were for pancakes, even when they turned out lumpy. He helped her with homework, read with her in the evenings, and tried not to cry when she asked for just one more chapter, like it was something she had done with him 1,000 times before, even though this was still new. It wasn't always smooth. Sometimes she withdrew for no reason he could understand. Sometimes she got quiet during dinner and wouldn't talk much until bedtime. And sometimes she would mention a memory, like the time she and Haley built a cardboard castle in their old apartment, and he'd be reminded again of how many moments he had missed, how many years he couldn't get back. One Saturday, they sat on the edge of the dock by the lake, their feet dangling over the water. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning to slip behind the trees, and Sophie was humming some tune from a cartoon she liked. "You ever think about when you were little?" he asked. She shrugged. "Sometimes. Mommy tells me stories about when I was a baby." He looked out at the lake. "I wish I could have seen more of those years. I think about them a lot." Sophie didn't say anything for a moment. Then she leaned a little against his arm, not enough to call it a hug, but more than a casual movement. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters, right?" He looked down at her and smiled. It wasn't a grand moment, not a scene for a movie. But it was real. It was slow and quiet and true. Later that week, Haley stopped by to drop off a school form that needed both their signatures. She stepped inside just long enough to see the living room, the way Sophie's shoes were by the door, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, a glass of orange juice still on the kitchen counter. "You've made it feel like home," she said, almost surprised. "I'm trying," he said. She nodded, lingering at the doorway before leaving. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something else, but instead, she gave him a small, tired smile and turned to go. As the weeks passed, Matthew's life began to quiet in a way it never had before. He stepped away from daily operations at his company, handing over the reins to someone he trusted. His days were no longer broken into meetings and stock updates, but into school pickups, math quizzes, and lunchbox notes. It was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and completely transformative. Every evening when Sophie curled up in her bed and asked, "Are you staying tomorrow too?" and he could say, yes, with absolute certainty, he felt something inside him stitch back together. He wasn't rebuilding the past anymore. He was building something new. Something solid. Something that could last. The morning of the school play was bright and unusually warm for early spring. The trees lining the street in front of the elementary school were just beginning to bloom, casting soft shadows on the sidewalk as parents and children hurried toward the entrance with bouquets, cameras, and folded programs clutched in their hands. Matthew stood near the back of the auditorium, a small bouquet of yellow daisies in one hand and his heart thudding in his chest like he hadn't felt since his first public speaking event years ago. But this was different. This wasn't about shareholders or headlines. This was about Sophie. He spotted her behind the curtain a few minutes before the show began. She was in costume, a white robe with silvery wings and a simple halo made of wire and tinsel. Her blonde curls framed her face, and her blue eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on him. She didn't wave, but she smiled, and that one look held more power than anything he'd ever experienced in a boardroom. He smiled back and mouthed, "You've got this." She nodded slightly, then turned back to her classmates. Haley arrived shortly after, slipping into the seat beside him. They exchanged a brief look, an acknowledgement of how far they had come without needing to say a word. There was no tension anymore, no lingering heat from the courtroom or old arguments. There was still history between them, but it had softened, like old photographs that no longer hurt to look at. When the play began, the audience hushed as the children filed onto the stage. The performance was simple, charming, filled with forgotten lines, exaggerated gestures, and a soundtrack that occasionally skipped. Sophie played the angel who guided two lost children back to their family, a role she took on with an earnestness that made Matthew's throat tighten with emotion. Her voice was clear and steady, her stage presence surprisingly natural. Every time she turned to face the audience, her eyes searched for her parents, always finding them in the crowd. As the final scene approached, the children stood in a semicircle, and the lights dimmed except for the soft glow around Sophie. She stepped forward alone, holding a small lantern prop, and spoke the last lines of the play, lines she had helped write with her teacher's encouragement. "This is a story about finding the way home," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "Sometimes people get lost, even grown-ups. But love is what brings them back. This is for my dad. He found me. And I found him." The room fell into stunned silence, and then came the sound of 100 parents clapping, cheering, some wiping tears. But Matthew couldn't move. He sat frozen, his eyes full, his heart cracked wide open. Haley reached over and put her hand gently over his. He didn't even look at her. He just squeezed it. After the show, children flooded the hallways, pulling off wings and tossing halos, trading flowers and cupcakes. Sophie ran up to him, breathless and glowing with pride. He crouched down and handed her the daisies, and she threw her arms around his neck without hesitation. "You were amazing," he whispered. "I mean it. You were born for this." She grinned. "I told you I liked the spotlight." Haley joined them a moment later, smiling quietly. She knelt beside them, brushing Sophie's hair back from her face. "You made a lot of people cry in there, you know that?" Sophie looked proud. "Good tears." The three of them stood there in the hallway for a long moment, surrounded by the noise and chaos of other families, and yet wrapped in a quiet of their own. It wasn't perfect. It was still new and fragile. But it was real. As they walked out into the sunshine, Sophie reached up and grabbed both their hands without saying anything. One small hand in each of theirs, swinging slightly as they moved down the steps and into the street. They weren't a traditional family. They weren't what they used to be. But they were something new, something chosen, something earned. Matthew looked at Haley as they walked, his voice low so Sophie wouldn't hear. "Do you think," he asked, "maybe one day, we could find our way back too?" Haley didn't answer right away. She just glanced over at him with a look that held 1,000 stories, some painful, some beautiful, all unfinished. "Maybe," she said softly. "One day." And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. This ending isn't loud or cinematic, it's something more powerful, honest. It closes not with grand gestures or perfect resolutions, but with the quiet, lived-in truth that real healing takes time, presence, and patience. Matthew doesn't magically erase the past, and Haley doesn't instantly fall back into his arms. But they both choose to show up. They choose their daughter. And in doing so, they begin to choose each other again, not for who they were, but for who they're becoming. That's what makes this story resonate. It reminds us that redemption is rarely dramatic, it's in the slow rebuilding, the daily showing up, the unspoken forgiveness, and the soft hope that maybe, one day, broken things can become beautiful again.